These are the notes for Algebra 1A, Lesson 1-3, Order of Operations, Property of Numbers. The objectives say, recognize the properties of equality and identity, recognize the commutative and associative properties. Vocabulary, equivalent expressions, expressions that denote the same value for all values of the variables. Reciprocal, the multiplication inverse of a number. Now you need to find your handout titled The Number Properties. We're going to go through these and we're going to leave off one of them today and add something new. First of all, commutative property. This is of addition. If you're adding numbers and you switch the order, that's commutative property of addition. If you're multiplying numbers and you switch the order, that's multiplicative property of, or commutative property of multiplication. And then we have associative property for addition. This means you keep the same order, you just switch where your parentheses are. And for multiplication, you keep the same order, you just switch where your parentheses are. Another rule for numbers or property is multiplicative property of 0. That means you take a number and you multiply it times 0, it's going to be 0. Now let's go down to additive identity. This means if you have a number and you add 0, it still equals that number. Additive inverse means if you add opposite numbers, you will get 0. So a positive of one number plus the negative of that number equals 0. Multiplicative identity means if you have a number and you multiply it by 1, you get that number. Multiplicative inverse means if you have a fraction and you multiply it and flip it over, it equals 1. And one that we're going to add to our properties list is called substitution. If you have an expression and you simplify it onto the next line, all you've done is substituted for what that expression was. And it could be in multiplication, it could be in addition, subtraction, or division. But here are two examples, one in addition and one in multiplication. So those are some properties that we're going to be using today. Let's start with example 1A. We have a lot going on in this problem, but we need to rely on what we learned from lesson 1-2, and that would be the order of operations. First of all, we will start with our parentheses. Inside of our parentheses, we have division and subtraction, which would be first division. So let's do 15 divided by 3, which is 5. Bring down the rest of the math problem. There's a lot to do here. Now, what did we do? But we substituted 5 for simplifying 15 divided by 3. So we're going to call that the property of substitution that we used. Okay, let's look and see what else we need to do. Again, we're going to go back to our parentheses, and we are going to put in a 0 for 5 minus 5. Bring down the rest of what you have in your math problem. Now, 15 minus 5, we could say is the same as adding its opposite because we ended up with 0. And we had a property called additive inverses. When you add them together, you get 0. Now that we are done with our parentheses, we look for exponents. There are no exponents, so we need to work multiplication left to right. I have multiplication on the left side. I have multiplication on the right. When we're listing specific properties of our steps, you need to do one at a time. So let's start over here. 15 times 1 is 15. Bring down the rest of your math problem. Now, we had a property that says when you take a number, multiply by 1, you get that number. And we called that multiplicative identity. We get the identical number. I'll let you use abbreviations for these. Now what do we do in our next step? We still have some multiplication to do. So let's do this. It becomes 0. So we have 15 minus 9 plus 0. And this is multiplication. Did we have a multiplication property that said if you multiply by 0, you get 0? That's the multiplication property of 0. Next, let's go on. We have 15 minus 9 plus 0. 15 minus 9, we're going to do first because we're working left to right, and we end up with 6. There's not a specific property that fits this scenario. We came up with 6. So what did we do? We simplified it, which is only substitution. And then 6 plus 0 is 6. There is a property that says if you add 0 to a number, you get the number you started out with. And that was additive identity. Lots of different properties that we use to come up with our final solution. Just know that these are rules that help us arrive at our final answer. Now let's look at example 1b. Again, we have a lot going on here, but we're going to follow the order of operations. So let's start with our parentheses. 6 divided by 3 is 2. So now inside of our parentheses, we have 2 minus 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring down the rest of my problem. And all we did was simplify the 6 divided by 3 to 2. So we're going to call this substitution. Continue inside your parentheses. 2 minus 2 is 0. And this is the same as adding its opposite. So we have 0, and I'm going to bring down the rest of my problem. Adding the opposite is called additive inverse. Now we have multiplication here and here. Let's work left to right. 18 times 1 is 18. Bring down the rest of your math problem. There is a multiplication property that says if you multiply by 1, you get the exact number or the identical number. And that is multiplicative identity. We still have this multiplication here at the end. 2 times 0 is 0. Bring down the rest of your math problem. There is a multiplication property that says if you multiply by 0, you get 0. And it's called the multiplication property of 0. Now we have subtraction and addition. Since they can be done in the same step, let's work left to right. 18 minus 3 is 15. There's not a specific property that talks about this subtraction, so we're just going to call this substitution because we simplified it. And 15 plus 0 is 15. Again, adding 0 is a property of ours. We get the identical number we started out with, So we actually use the rule of additive identity. Let's look at example 1C. Example 1C, we have a lot of multiplication here, and it's all multiplication. Anytime you have all multiplication or all addition, you want to think of associative properties and commutative properties. And you want to be able to group these so that when you multiply them, you can get whole numbers. So you want to come up with groupings to make whole numbers. So the way it's set up, I do not think 4/5 times 18 will give me a whole number. But if I take 4/5 times 25, since 5 and 25 are multiples of 5, I think those should go together. So I'm going to rearrange this to have 4/5 times 25. And if I look at this denominator and this number, 9 and 18 are both multiples of 9. So I'm going to group these two together. There is a property that says when you're multiplying, you can change the order, and that is multiplicative property. Let's start again. When you rearrange the order, that's commutative property of multiplication. And you can just give me 3 letters, commutative property of multiplication. Now that I have them rearranged, I want to show some groupings. I'm going to show what two numbers I'm multiplying together by grouping. And this grouping is the associative property of multiplication. So let's go ahead and simplify. 4/5 times 25, if you put that into your calculator, it is 20. And then 2/9 of 18 is 4. All we did was simplify here to give us whole numbers. This is called substitution. And now we have some whole numbers that we can multiply. 20 times 4 gives you 80. And that's also substitution. Example D, 3/4 times 10 times 16 times 1/2. So we have all multiplication. You may want to rearrange this so that you can group to make whole numbers. If I look at 3/4, it will not give me a whole number if I multiply it by 10. But if I look at 3/4 and multiply it by 16, it will, because 4 and 16 are multiples of 4. So I'm going to rearrange this, and I'm going to make 3/4 times 16 together, and then I'm going to put 10 and 1/2 together. So I rearranged this. That is commutative property of multiplication. Now I'm going to group them. This grouping shows that I'm going to be multiplying 3/4 and 16, 10, and 1/2. The grouping is associative property of multiplication. Let's simplify. 3/4 times 16 is 12. And 1/2 of 10 is 5. This is substitution, just like the last one. 12 times 5 is 60, and that would be substitution as well. Now let's look at part E. We have all addition in part E. So we want to think about associative and commutative properties. You want to rearrange these so that you can make groups of 10. So what with this 6 would make 10? Well, 6 plus 4 is 10. So we're going to group those two together. 36 plus 14. And what number plus 3 gives you a 10? It's 7. So let's group those together. And we're adding, so just rearranging these is the commutative property of addition. Now I want to group together the numbers that I'm adding together first. Adding these two, and then the last two. And this grouping is called associative property of addition. And let's simplify. 36 and 14 would be 50. 23 and 7 would be 30. All we did was simplify, so this is substitution. 50 plus 30 is 80. Again, all we did was simplify, so this is called substitution as well. Let's look at letter F. On letter F, this is the problem that you have. I would like for you to pause the video and try to run through each step, giving it a property as you go. And when you are done, come back and look at the answers that I have and fix anything that you might need to change in order to have this done correctly. On letter F, these are your steps. You should have divided first to give yourself 2, and that is simply substitution. Then, inside your parentheses, 2 minus 1 is 1. Again, that is simply substitution. And then you're going to have multiplication here straight across. The 2 times 1 is 2. We're getting the identical number, so that's multiplicative identity. And then we're multiplying 2 and 1/2 together. Those are reciprocals of each other, and they give us 1, so it is multiplicative inverse. These notes will go along with the assignment that you have in Google Classroom.